Bonjour à tous.
Hello everybody, thank you for being here on this sunny afternoon. I'm first of all very proud to have on this roundtable the most feminine roundtable of these 3 days, so we're really proud. It's a sign that without a doubt there's also an issue. You know, we're talking about woman power earlier, so in the energy sector. So obviously the crisis that we just went through gave rise to the question on the fragility of our global economy, and faced to the pandemics and the climate change, the question arises on how to reconcile an industry which requires more and more energy, notably electricity, and we will address that. How can we change our way of life and save energy? So we'll have to make choices. We'll talk about public policies, but not only. We will also have to integrate in the development of businesses this notion of sustainable development. In other words, in the past and in the world of before, you had to be profitable and then sustainable. Today, in the mode of financing of businesses, we will have to be, and we hope that it will be the case, we have to be sustainable if we want to be profitable. Now we'll talk about this with the different people around this table. But first of all, the debate. Eric Labaye will set the terms of this debate. So, the president of the engineering school. Good afternoon, everybody. In fact, today the topic is a real energy strategy. That's the title. So what does that mean, the reality of a strategy? So the world of energy is faced with two challenges. On the one hand, you have a link with the economic growth since the Industrial Revolution and the growth in the demand for energy. And we see today that there is a world that continues to grow in terms of population. Part of these population need energy to improve their quality of life. So there's a tension on the demand for energy. On the other side, you have the question of climate warming and the decarbonation of our energy. We know that we have 2,000 billion tons of CO2 that were produced since the beginning of the industrial era, notably due to coal, oil, and gas, and 30% due to deforestation. And today we need to decarbonate. We have the Paris agreements. We have a lot of states that have committed themselves on that. And so we have to find the elements of the strategy. We have to do a rupture in what we did in the past, a drastic change in our energetic strategy. For me, I would set 4 elements on the table for this discussion. For the first element is the level of ambition. So we'll have to discuss on that. Do we have the good level of ambition for our energy strategy? We have the Paris Agreement. Several countries have committed themselves, but today we have about 50% of the states that have committed themselves for to be neutral in carbon by 2050. So 50%, it's a first step. Will we reach the 100%? Because we know 100% of neutrality leads to 1.5 growth rate rather than 2 or more. So the level of ambition, first. Second, do we have all the components for an energy strategy? Do we work on each of these components? First element is the mix, the energy mix. Renewables, nuclear, fossil, new technologies. So a lot of questions arise around this mix. Is it reliable? That's really important. And secondly, do we have a good degree of sovereignty? Because energy is part of the sovereignty of a country. So the sovereignty of the mix, does it correspond to these two characteristics? The second element of the strategy is on the consumer side. Okay, we have production and then we have consumption. So what are the evolution in the consumption that we expect? So here, there are 3 questions on the table. First, energy efficiency. Can we improve the efficiency? Lower the consumption for a given performance. The second element is flexibility. Do we manage to put in phase the demand and the production? And the third is sobriety. You know, on the demand side, can we eventually lower the demand? So 3 questions. Obviously, over and above all this, the production and demand are the 2 strategies okay. And I'll add a third element, which is innovation. We know that an energy strategy I talk with the heads of the large groups. Between 30 and 40, 50% of the technology is required for 2050 to reach the carbon neutrality are not invented yet or finalized. So we have a big challenge in terms of innovation. Thierry Blanchard's report said that 4% of the R&D, world R&D, is in the green techs. So it's not much. So there's a deficit of quantity. What is the right level of investment? On what technology? How do we improve PV? Hydraulics, hydrogen, or the capture, the CO2 capture. We can invent new means of production, but we can capture the CO2 in the production center. So we can reuse the invested capital. A set of questions that arise around innovation and new technologies. The fourth element is financing. Financing, well, the figures that were given since yesterday are in thousands of billions of euros. We have the recovery plan, which is greener, but what about the private assets, private equity, investment capital? So what is the coherence between the financing, the consumption means, and the production means, and the question of innovation? The fifth element in the strategy I would mention is regulation. Regulation. We know that the regulation of the markets will enable the actors to make progress, and in particular on the cost of CO2, CO2 tax, the cost of carbon, for example, what kind of competition, what kind of incentives. So on these five elements, we'll have international examples. Not everybody operates the same way. The price for the consumer is not the same from country to country. The mix is not the same, but do the five axes give the right coherence to reach our ambitions? And the last point on a real strategy, the third point is, do we have the path, the way to go? And that's the question of the speed, the momentum. Okay, we have a great ambition. We're making progress on 5 subjects, but are we moving at the right momentum, at the right pace? And we'll see what the panelists say on that, but it's a question of the operationalization of the strategy. We see not all the countries are moving at the same pace. And the last element is the social acceptability. We saw that the people in the roundabouts with the yellow jackets, acceptability is not the same. The price is not accepted the same way. A change in behaviors is not necessarily accepted. So there's a question of strategy of the change. We see that the energy strategy is multi-usage, multi-actors, and global, and change everything. But the COPs, the COPs are very important in terms of governance, but in each country, in each of the sector, how do the businesses move forward, how the consumers move forward, how can we all together adopt the same path to determine the strategy? So ambition, levers, speed or momentum, pace, and acceptability would seem to me the elements we should discuss here. And if I may, for positive on each these topics, we can say that we have a real strategy and we will reach the objectives that we have set for the environment and the economy. Thank you, Eric. So with us on this panel, we have Christelle Bory, President of Aramed, Tian Elberg, who is in a video conference with us of Wind Denmark, Marianne Leniu, who is the President of Enedis, Noura Mansouri, who is a researcher at the MIT, notably, and Sylvie Oziel, the President of Envy Young Digital, something like that, I'm sorry. So we'll do a first round table. It was interesting what Eric Labaye was saying. We'll start with you, Christelle Bory, the issue of the sovereignty faced to new energies and energetic independence that we mentioned. If we use less hydrocarbons, well, we need to call for more raw materials. I saw that on this point, Europe depends on 75 to 75 or 80% on these raw materials. So less fossil energies means more metals. So it's true. If you want to have a real energy strategy, you need to have a good a real raw material strategy and to store renewable energies, transport and electricity to produce batteries. You need a lot of metals, rare metals often. It's a good thing, a priori, because the metals, if they're produced in the proper conditions, produces less CO2 than fossil energies, and it can be independently recycled. So we create a circular economy for the future, which is quite efficient. On the other hand, the problem is the dependence of Europe over these the supply of these metals. I'll take the electric vehicles, for example. A battery for an electric car it represents 350 kilos of weight, 30 to 40% of the car value, automobile value. It's made of metals. So in such batteries, in a standard battery, you have about 50 kilos of nickel, about the same in lithium, and about 5 and 7 kilos of cobalt. It's a lot of metals, and to manage to reach an objective of 50% of sales of electric cars in the world by 2030, if you take the example of nickel, you have to increase the production by 1 million tons, I guess it's per year, and transform 1 additional million tons, 50% more than the whole consumption for other applications today. To give you an order of size, the project to transform is 50,000 tons, and it costs 2 billion for the first transformation to produce nickel salts that will enter into the value chain. So 1 million tons is about 20 projects, 40 billion. For cobalt, we talk about multiplying by 3 the present production, lithium by 4. So we will need massively those metals, those raw materials, and Europe doesn't have any on its territory. So Europe, as you said, depends at 75 to 80% of the imports in metals, up to 100%. Even if we develop everything we found some lithium, I think it was in Spain, we will supply 10 to 15% of our needs. So we will have to find those raw materials outside Europe. And that's what major industries have understood. China, to start with, who for years have invested massively outside its territory because it doesn't have those resources forever. So it's investing in Latin America, in Russia, in Indonesia, and Africa to find these metals, and it holds about 50% of the mining resource. World mining resource is about 70% of the refinery capacity. So we will make a lot of gigafactories in Europe. There's a real political will to do this, but they have to be supplied. So behind that, you will have to have a real financial policy, geopolitics on behalf of the states to do like what these other countries do. And the United States are entering the battle, and Europe cannot be the last to enter the battle. The Asians do that very well. The Japanese, Koreans are investing. Europe doesn't have a strategy, and all the recovery plans are pointing to Europe of what we will do in Europe, not towards raw materials outside of Europe, but they are outside Europe, so that's where we will have to secure these supplies. So it'd be interesting to react with Sylvie Oziel, because Envision Digital, as you saw, inaugurate with the President of the Republic in Douai the project for a battery factory at the beginning of the week. So to continue, we have Jan Ilberg. Can you hear us? We hope that the technology will serve us. Yes. Welcome, Jan. So the energy transition goes through the access to new renewable energies through the democratization of this offer. Today, is that a proposal that is given enough recognition?
I think so. For example, in a Danish case, if I can refer to that, we by law have decided that we will be carbon neutral by 2050, and we will reduce the carbon footprint by 70% compared to 1990 in 2030. So the entire parliament have agreed on that's the target to reach. And now we in Denmark discuss how to do it. And seen from a Danish perspective, there is only one way of doing decarbonizing of society, which means that we have to electrify as much as possible. First of all, direct electrification, and then indirect electrification afterwards. And now we discuss, and later this year we will have the first decisions in Parliament about how to do it concretely. It's clear that if you first of all have a strategy, you also need the concrete specific targets for the different sectors, and then you need to have a very concrete plan for how to reach it and how to go there. And I think such a plan, that's the most important tool to ensure public-private partnership and a public discussion about how to do it in practice. And on that note, also the best way of getting social acceptance on all what is needed to bring the society into a fossil-free future.
Okay, thank you. Sur cette transition énergétique qu'on évoquait.
This energy transition that we mentioned with Jan Ilberg, Manyan Liu, we see that, and we've said that since the beginning, we need a real policy, public policy. But when we talk of renewable energies, we think of electricity to start with. And we're under the impression that you'll be extremely greedy in electricity. Will need a lot of energy with a multitude of connected objects, the recourse to this electrical energy. How do we manage, in reality, to make all these needs compatible in electricity with our capacity? Good question. I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, you're right. The ecological transition that we are seeing, in which the electrical distribution network of energies is very important, will turn into an increase of electricity in the final consumption, because fossil energies will progressively be replaced in both sectors, emitting sectors, which are transport and buildings. The share of electricity will be greater and greater. But no, because this final consumption, we did some prospective studies at the horizon of 2050. It will not massively increase. So our aim is not to face a massive growth of consumption of electricity and energy in general, because the efforts in terms of energy efficiency will compensate for the needs and the usages for electricity, which are exponentially growing. Our Danish colleague talked about renewable energies, but here the French strategy to fight against climate change has very strong ambitions, which lead to the doubling in a few years of the production of electricity of renewable origin, solar and wind, but also hydraulic. And 90% is connected to the network exploited by energies. To be concrete, today we have 450,000 production sites for wind turbines. In 4 years, it will be between 1 and 2 million turbines. So we are multiplying by 2 or 3-fold. And so it is also shown in our investment, because behind that you need an infrastructure which allows for this evolution. But this very strong trend is also found with electric vehicles. We've discussed this a lot in the different roundtables. Today, nobody's asking whether they believe or not in the hybrid or electric vehicle. Manufacturers discussed that. European manufacturers will have a meeting in July on when they announce the end of the thermal engine. So here again, it's exponential. In 2020, the production increased by 160%. And so we have also scenarios for electrical vehicles, hybrid vehicles by 2035 with different scenarios. We were on a curve of 9 million, and we're now on a curve of 15 million vehicles. So so many new usages of electricity, which involve a need for a new infrastructure, but not only investments. And it generates 4 billion in investments every year, 4 times more than 10 years ago, but a lot of innovation also. Capacity to pilot objects that are more and more increasingly connected on our networks. The Linky, for example, metering system, which enables to pilot your self-consumption. The research also, it contributes to research, investments in infrastructure, innovation, and also the need to accompany consumers and the pedagogy of these new usages, and to master, that's the sustainability, their final electrical bill.
Des aspects que vous évoquiez, Marianne Legnaud. Noura Mansouri, j'ai signalé que vous étiez chercheuse au MIT tout à l'heure. Vous êtes également membre du Centre de recherche et d'études sur le pétrole du roi Abdallah en Arabie Saoudite. Et on sait que, évidemment, les grands pays pétroliers sont en train de chercher des relais de croissance pour l'après-pétrole. Côté européen, on cherche aussi les moyens de, je pense à l'hydrogène vert, aux Allemands qui ont pris des capacités de parcs solaires pour pouvoir produire de l'électricité afin de faire de l'hydrogène vert. Est-ce que les pays pétroliers sont en mesure d'assurer cette transition vers une énergie plus verte et décarbonée aujourd'hui?
Merci. Je comprends très bien le français, but for today I will speak in English. I hope you don't mind. Thank you for this very important question. It's actually an anchoring question that I ask myself and one that has motivated my career throughout the years. Of course, major oil-producing countries, including my own country, Saudi Arabia, as a top producer, is very important to the energy today. It has fueled economic development, civilization, as we know it today, and it will continue to be important for many generations to come. Of course, as Eric was saying earlier, there are many challenges to having a real energy strategy, including on one end, meeting the many, such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, specifically UN SDG 13 on climate action, the Paris Agreement. We all know that the world is still not on track to tackle the climate crisis. At the same time, we have the world is also not on track to meet the UN SDG 7 on energy access. We still have today over 850 million people with no energy access and over 1 billion people with no clean cooking. So even though we discussed here the real energy strategy in Aix-en-Provence in France, we should take into account, the families in Africa who have no access to energy, no access to clean cooking. Having said that, of course, climate change is an urgent global problem and we must tackle it. And we must look for new ways and real ways to deal with this problem. Saudi Arabia, during the G20 presidency last year, has proposed the circular carbon economy, or the CCE. And I'll take a minute here to explain what it is. The CCE is an energy strategy that's integrated, holistic, inclusive, pragmatic, more importantly, and one that's based on the 4 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. It allows the participation of different sectors, different energy technologies, including hard-to-abate sectors, for instance, that are very much entrenched into carbon and hydrocarbons. They make up over 1/3 of carbon emissions, so allowing the participation of these sectors is important for a global transition towards carbon circularity and neutrality. Now, renewable energy, of course, there are many triumphs and many strides to the technology, its development, lowering its cost, but a lot of these sectors that I mentioned are still very much entrenched into hydrocarbons, so it's important, especially in light of COVID-19 and the stimulus packages, to think of large investments in abatement technologies that can allow the hydrocarbons to transition towards carbon circularity and neutrality, including technologies that Eric earlier mentioned, such as carbon capture and storage, clean hydrogen, as you were saying, reducing the gap between green and blue hydrogen and brown hydrogen, which is very significant today, and really allowing the participation of all the energy technologies and being inclusive about it. Thank you.
Thank you. On a beaucoup parlé depuis le...
We talked a lot since the beginning of this conversation, Sylvie Oziel, of the needs in electrical batteries for vehicles, notably, and obviously you are familiar with this question, connected objects, electric vehicle, and energy transition. Are we in a triptych that is completing itself, or is it an antagonism? antagonistic. Our fundamental vision, and vision is a vision for energy and the environment. So our fundamental vision is to have a non-Malthusian decarbonation that contributes to the growth of the economy, and it's the technologies that make this possible. In fact, our point of view is that technology is not the limiting factor. To talk about the innovation Eric mentioned, we think innovation is abundant, that there are technological solutions to decarbonate usages that are constantly heavier, like green hydrogen, and it's becoming more and more industrial, so it's less costly, contrarily to gas, the price of gas and oil, which fluctuates on the markets. If you look at the cost of batteries or the cost of the solar energy, it follows the law, the rule. So it's exponentially reduced. Wind turbines have the price has reduced by 40%. Solar, 82%. Batteries saw their cost being reduced by 88%, and so it's spectacular, and it's continuing. So it's a technology that is available and more and more cheap. And with the offshore and the floating offshore wind turbines, very abundant resource of energy. And today, with 2 centimes of the kilowatt hour, we're faced with the cheapest energy that the human race has ever produced. So fantastic potential of development. So everything's going in the best world. But for us to manage to accelerate this transformation, if it's not technology that is hindering this, Eric talked about 4 components. We articulate 5 components. So we are looking at 5 dimensions. First dimension, industrial technologies, digital technologies. So the issue of infrastructure, regulations, and the business model, the market design, which we think that when you look at all the different dimensions, the role of the state is not only to trigger activities with some seed funds, but it's to line up these different dimensions so the technology can be massively adopted and create sustainable business models structurally that the markets will adopt. And in practice, maybe a few examples. The renewable energy at the beginning of their development benefit from subsidized tariffs are injected in the electric network with a feed-in tariff. So when you remove this feed-in tariff, you need to have a certification mechanism for the green origin that enable to value the green characteristic of the energy. When you inject a lot of renewable energy, there's a problem of flexibility. The network, you have to strengthen the network infrastructure, have solutions of flexibility that to the different ways of paying for this flexibility, electric vehicles, a lot of regulations there. The infrastructure, which are at the charge of the public, for the intelligent load to charge your battery in at the right time of the day when there's no big demand. It's also we have to make things easier. The obligation of asking the building syndicate to install a charging station. So there are all kinds of complex layers that add up and that that hinder the development in the transport infrastructures for hydrogen, carbon economy, around the lowering of the emissions. And some are more in favor of the nuclear, others for wind energy. There are different currents that express themselves. So we think there's another 2 years of discussion before we end up with the regulations. That's what stops massive investments. It's not the abundance of the natural resource, the fact that there's a market, but it's the regulatory and financial status.
Eric, Labaye, if we were to sum up after these different presentations, I think we can say there's an ecosystem that is starting to emerge, and the issue is to marry the needs and uses with the production capacities. That is the challenge, really, to be able to have a successful environmental and energy transition. Yes, you have to bring them together, and you have to make sure they're both on the same curve. If we are looking at 2050 to achieve carbon neutrality. We have a centre called Energy for Climate, which is a research centre working on this issue. They've produced some models for forecasting. So the humanity is going to increase population by 3 billion. The GDP is going to increase by 3%. That's going to continue. So the average standard of living is going to increase. The energy intensity is going to reduce because of introduced energy efficiency, 10% less every 3 years. Then we have to reduce 75% of the carbon intensity of the energy that is produced by 2050. That is a big step to take. So we need to know whether we'll be able to take that step, whether we'll be able to accelerate sufficiently to do that. It depends on the market structures, it depends on the environment around us and how all the different stakeholders are aligned. So they change their behaviors, we accelerate their transformation, they can make better use of the technologies. For me, the challenge is that everybody's moving forward, but we have to have a better coherence and make sure we're on the right slope that will bring us to the right place. Nouman Sanri, we know that Saudi Arabia has begun its energy transition. To react to what Eric was saying just now, are all of the countries going quickly enough, do you think, to be able to integrate this transition of our energy sources?
Yeah, thank you very much. Important question. Indeed, Saudi Arabia has started the transition a long time ago. There are many initiatives that we can talk about today. There's been an announcement on the Saudi Green Initiative, which is to plant 1 billion trees across the kingdom and 40 billion across the region. This is, of course, an important carbon sink and a climate mitigation strategy. On the energy mix side, Saudi Arabia plans to introduce renewable energy quite aggressively, plan to have 50% renewable energy by 2030, and projects are already underway, solar energy, wind energy, nuclear energy. So this is a perfect transition to clean energy. There's also plans for hydrogen in the future city of Neom. It will be home to the world's largest green hydrogen produced from renewable energy. Plans to have 650 tons daily to be produced and exported. In fact, the world have seen the first shipment of blue ammonia going from Saudi Arabia to Japan. It was produced from hydrocarbons using carbon capture and storage, so it's clean blue hydrogen, and it will be used in Japan power plants with carbon-free energy. Saudi Arabia is also home to the world's largest carbon capture, utilization and storage, where carbon is seen as an important and valuable feedstock to the industry rather than just a negative externality. So carbon is being recycled and reused in the industry for carbon-based applications. There's also very stringent regulations on the environment across all the sector, building codes, energy efficiency, and so on. On the economic diversification side, Saudi Arabia also has announced a lot of plans for new infrastructure projects and new economic cities, including the futuristic city of Neom, which plans to be powered 100% by renewable energy, and other projects, including the Red Sea project, Amala, and Giddiya. This is just a small example of the efforts on economic diversification that the kingdom is working on.
Marianne Legnaud, quand on regarde la facture d'électricité des ménages, on voit que...
When we look at the household use of energy, a third of the household use is linked to heating. We've talked about carbon tax earlier, and we've talked about the yellow vest movement. If we're talking about energy transition, to get that accepted by households and population, can we use that cursor, do you think, including with new technologies, to reduce the cost of grid maintenance? Yeah, a third of the electricity invoice, 2/3 are not completely equal, but on a major third is the tax. The other third, the largest third, is everything to do with production and commercialization and the supply, and then a smaller third, which is still roughly a third, which is a cost of transmission and distribution. However, it's not only for maintenance of the grid, okay? That's important to point out. It's not maintenance, it's transmission and distribution. Talk about 4 billion euros of investment by Enedis in a grid which is the largest in Europe, which is 35 times around the world, if it was laid out flat. Every 4 years, we renew it, and we carry out maintenance, as you said, to deal with climate hazards and contingencies which are becoming more frequent, as we know, particularly heat waves. There's also an important proportion devoted to developing and building and responding to new uses. So resilience, maintenance, and also new investment for growth. Yes, as Eric said, this transition is ecological. It has to be sustainable for the consumer's electricity bill, although today the French energy mix has an energy bill which is 15% lower than the neighboring countries such as Italy or Germany. We have to be attentive to the sustainability of the bill. That doesn't mean that means we have to be careful where we invest. We have to pool our investments. We have to increase flexibility to produce intelligent solutions for connections so that we have several types of energy producers together. It's also a question of using the potential of Linky also to bring down the bills. ADEME estimates that thanks to Linky, with 35 million meters by the end of the year, and there are other suppliers. There are 20 energy suppliers. There were no additional suppliers 5 years ago. Then we have energy efficiency actions as well, such as turning off the lights and reducing the level of heating in the home. These are important points. So by controlling investment, we make the best possible use of the data, the consumption data, and the data for management of the networks and grids. This is what we do. For example, we help with thermal renovation projects with local authorities to demonstrate to them that thanks to the data we make available to them, a particular project or a particular building is consuming far too much energy. So we use a lot of technology, and also we use social responsibility a great deal. We have to include the consumer in what we do. They don't fully understand how the energy market is organized, and that is our role as a stakeholder to inform people. And all of this has a cost for a public service such as the one we provide. And for ecological transition, you need to have a public service, you need to have gains in productivity, you have to be more efficient, and you have to keep controlling and producing energy savings to provide a better service to your customers. So as we're listening to our other panelists, we can see that there is a worldwide demand, which is more or less the same everywhere, for a transition with new technologies. But nevertheless, we have the impression these solutions are rather local. There's no overall strategy. And you were saying earlier that this transition, I'll go back to the words you used, you said it's become a geopolitical and economic issue. Because of this demand, there are stakeholders who are getting ahead of others. Yes, they are getting ahead of others in the upstream part of the chain. That's what I was saying earlier. Let me go back to the example of batteries. We're going to have enough gigafactories in Europe to supply all of our electric vehicles in Europe, no problem there. We're going to, with the projects that have been announced so far, with the manufacturing of cathodes that are used in the batteries, we have 45 or 50% of our needs will be covered. When we look at the raw materials for these cathodes, the cells that are used, etc., for these cathodes, we only have about 10 or 15% of the capacity required. The problem, once more, is that we have to look at the whole value chain. We have to look at it from the economic point of view and from the point of view of sovereignty, and then it's geopolitics that comes into play. There are countries that have understood that this is a question of sovereignty, and this crisis has shown us that in certain subjects, the lack of supply in certain strategic areas caused a lot of problems during the pandemic. So we have to be very careful with this transition. I'd like to add another dimension, which is the sustainable development dimension and societal responsibility dimension. When we focus on CO2, which is very good, of course, as Eric pointed out, This accumulates in the atmosphere, and it's a very big issue, of course, but we shouldn't do that at any social cost or environmental cost. Above and beyond the pure CO2 aspect, we have to be very careful with that, with this value chain. We have to look after consumers, as Marianne said. We have to be careful with the communities and people who are making a living thanks to this value chain. Also child labor in certain mines, for example, in certain countries, environmental safeguards as well. It's all very well having less CO2, and if we have loads of problems with the biodiversity and the environment, etc., that won't be a good solution. So that means we have to have special criteria. Yes, I think we're very lucky. We have standards in Europe that are very high. We have to impose our standards on the rest of the world. The advantage we have is that we are a big market. If people want to sell in Europe, we have to impose our standards on them to be able to enter into Europe, which are our standards, our environmental and societal standards for protection of all human rights. I think this is very important. Otherwise, our industries will be faced with social and environmental dumping, and we will not gain very much. We'll have more CO2. We'll have saved CO2, but we will have lost out on many other aspects. Jan Elberg, do you think there's an overall energy policy that has been set out by countries around renewable energy production or hydrogen, as was envisaged some time ago, where there would be, as we had the development of oil and coal and gas? Do you believe there's an industrial energy policy around renewable energies as well?
Countries, there are at least the first steps to also build an industry policy around the renewable policy developments. It's very important, as what's also have been discussed already in the panel, that we have to remember and see the green transition and the renewable-based transformation of the energy system and our societies together with the whole value chain and the industrial part of it. Because, of course, Europe can supply its own energy. If we just look at, for example, the offshore potential in the North Sea, we have a huge potential out there. If we just look at the Danish part of the North Sea, there's 3 times more energy out there than we, for example, in Denmark can use. The German renewable policy is clearly focusing at that Germany will be a net importer of green energy in the future. It will be renewable-based hydrogen, it will be electricity. So if we do the right strategies at a European level, and I think we really try to make the right strategies on the renewable side in Europe right now, and then we have a challenge in how to build the parallel industrial strategy on the side of that. Because the industry in this field in Europe, they do also compete globally. And therefore, there are some risks in doing industrial policy at a European level when we have to remember that we also compete in the global scale. I think in some markets, especially in relation to, for example, renewable-based hydrogen in Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and also other European countries, we now see discussions about how to, at the same time we produce a lot of renewable-based hydrogen, how do we create jobs and growth in the same countries at the same time.
Sylvie Ouziel, justement, on l'évoquait.
Sylvie Ouziel, we mentioned this earlier. There's a kind of duel between nuclear power and alternative energy, renewable energies. When we're talking about how we can produce energy for these batteries for electricity, is this a duel that is going to carry on? Is one of the stakeholders, one of these 2 areas, going to come up and mount on top of the other? This is a very European debate between nuclear and renewable energies. We don't think there's a single technology that's going to dominate and win everything. We think, for example, that carbon capture and sequestration that has been mentioned is a good transition energy. If you burn fossil fuels and capture carbon, until we can find a more long-term strategy to avoid emitting CO2 is a good solution. But of course, it can't be kept to be used in the long term. It's a good solution for transition, for gradual decarbonization. For nuclear power in France, we are lucky enough to have abundant nuclear power, which is very amortized, so it's not very expensive. Electricity does not produce any carbon, and it's controllable. In other words, we can choose whether to switch a nuclear power station on or off. You can't turn the sun or the wind on or off as you like. So that's the problem with the intermittent nature of the renewable energies. If we have to look at it from that point of view, if we're talking about building up nuclear energy massively, we will have the investments and the capital expenditure to deal with, and the safety criteria are also important as well. When you're talking about confinement and sequestration of CO2, we have to carry out an economic analysis of the advantages of nuclear compared to solar power and wind power, which are becoming more and more affordable. And the last subject is nuclear waste, of course. We are all aware of the fact that for any nuclear power is not a long-time solution. I think all renewable energies are increasingly relevant solution. Then as to whether we need to close down nuclear power plants gradually in France, that's another debate. No unceremony. We've often drawn a link between the pandemic we've just been through and the deterioration of nature and environmental damage and the climate emergency. Do you think there is a collective awareness around the world about these issues to say that we really have to accelerate the transition, whatever happens, however much it costs?
Thank you very much for the question. It's important to note the link between the pandemic and climate. The more we protect biodiversity, preserve biodiversity, and respect really the limits of biodiversity, ultimately we are benefiting by reducing these kinds of diseases. There are many studies that show that the pandemic and the diseases really come from crossing those boundaries of biodiversity. Having said that, of course, last year and the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the ways of our doing business and living. It has led to the shutdown of many critical sectors, reduced demand on energy, disrupted our lives and transportation. At the same time, the environment has flourished. At the same time, we had clearer air, reduced emissions, and a historic carbon crash at the time. You know, countries for the first time in India, for instance, they've seen the Himalayan mountains. But it's important to note that it is not us or the environment, the same way it is not us or the climate. The more important question is how to build a more sustainable, resilient, inclusive future that takes into consideration all of this. COVID-19 pandemic has to teach us a lesson in how to react cooperatively and very quickly to the climate before it creates this vicious cycle of impacting, at the end of the day, our livelihood. So the COVID-19 stimulus recovery packages need to take into consideration the investments in clean energy. Solar energy and wind energy in the past has received support and incentives from stimulus packages. Similarly, we must invest large-scale investments in carbon abatement technologies and linking really the economic plans with climate mitigation.
Marianne Legnaud, la question qu'évoquait Noura Mansouri, us or the climate, n'est plus la véritable question aujourd'hui.
Noura Mansouri has been talking about the problems of climate and the link between this and energy transition. We've talked about we're talking about maybe the symbol of the hummingbird that is carrying small tiny parts of water to put out a fire, or is it a phenomenon that means we can have a real role in the global system? Thank you for this question, which I think concerns us societal. If to look at the figures today, we can measure this. We distribute electricity to 95% of the territory, 110,000 auto producers of energy. This is somebody who usually installs solar panels on the roof of their house and produces renewable energy in an intermittent manner. That's why you still need the distribution network, of course, at night, and also to send to the grid the energy that is not consumed. So 110,000 is not very much, but it is 50% more than last year. So we are making progress. We believe this will double by the end of 2023. This is also an underlying trend. It's a societal trend where citizens want to be active players in this world of energy. They want to produce locally, they want to consume locally, they want to produce more green energy, and they want to be more responsible, and they want to include this in an economy that is circular, with recycling of the materials they use. I think this is a very strong underlying trend. The question then is, how do we reconcile models going to be more and more local with regions and metropolises and territories who demand the right to control their energy mix with a national industrial approach to infrastructure to make sure we make the right choices in the future. For example, we talked about solar energy development. You asked whether we're on the right curve. We're not on the right curve as defined by the government, although things are making progress. And what is the most important thing for the community? Is it to set up huge projects which will add a huge number of renewable megawatts? Or is it better to have a large number of smaller projects which will be more expensive in terms of the distribution network to connect them up, because it's much more complex technically and it's 3 times more expensive than large projects? So this is an important question. Although we're happy to see there's progress being made, we have to deal with these issues of cost for the community overall. However, the fact that everybody is aware that they need to make an effort, this is true for companies. We have, like every company here, we are reducing our carbon production, but this leads us to replace diesel electricity generators. They're very happy. Customers very happy when these diesel generators operate. We know in 4 or 5 times these diesel generators will no longer be acceptable. So we have to find a low carbon solution. Either it's a fuel cell that will be used instead of a diesel generator, and we are in the process of developing a prototype that will be announced next week. We have to be ready for the Olympic Games in 2024. So this is a long-term industrial vision, and at the same time we are meeting the requirements for low emissions. So this dual question between local and national is an important one. Yeah. Jan Ilberg, I'd like to have your opinion about what Marianne was saying now about the speed of transition. In France, this has been the country of diesel. 5 years ago, 3/4 of the vehicles in France were running on diesel. Today, less diesel vehicles are being sold in France than electric or hybrid vehicles. So things are changing very quickly. Do you think technology is changing quickly enough, and do you think it's adapting quickly enough to renewable and alternative energies? Or this speed of acquisition by the public and these new types of use by the public, will this lead us to make decisions too quickly, which might not be the right ones in the long term?
I'm quite convinced that the technology development can follow. The reason why I think that we see this huge increased speed now in the transformation is, for example, in electrical vehicles, is that technology has developed and cost of energy is going down, mainly due to the fact that solar and wind power are so low in cost today that they basically works on a market condition. And this means that, for example, renewable-based hydrogen in some markets are very close to be competitive also at a market level. So cost of green energy has fallen dramatically the last 5 to 10 years, and it will continue to decrease. And at the same time, we see this huge development of the people in Europe and the rest of the world being very much aware of the climate change, and therefore we'll see people-driven development in some sectors. Some sectors, of course, will be difficult to deal with, but for example, in the transport sector, we also now foresee in Denmark it will become much quicker than expected just 2 years ago.
On s'approche de la fin de cette table ronde et je voudrais vous donner la...
We come to the end of our roundtable now. I'll hand over to the audience in a moment for a few questions. Crystal, Sylvia, Ozil, perhaps to end, and then we'll end with Eric after that. Crystal, Boris, we've talked a lot about the role that Europe could play in this new deal. It's an extraordinary market for many players to be able to conquer the European market. So we have the power to say no. This is what you were saying earlier. Do you think that thanks to this energy transition and based on this energy policy, that Europe has been able to break down certain taboos, particularly the idea that the world has to be open? I think we've made a lot of progress during the crisis in particular, because we've realized a number of things. I think Europe has shown that it is capable of reacting to this crisis and doing things that we could never have imagined just a few months previously. That having been said, on certain strategic dimensions, we still find it difficult for Europe to think outside its borders. Typically, the US has often had a strategy outside its borders. This is the way they think, and the same thing for the Asian countries, China as well. For those who are investing today in my area of raw materials in Africa and Latin America and Indonesia, these are the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans who are investing. And the Indonesians have a real policy protecting their resources. They represent 30% of the nickel worldwide. They're keeping it for themselves. In fact, they've put a ban on exporting minerals to keep the added value in their own country. So there's a real war, if you like, an economic war taking place around raw materials that is taking place. Europe has to think in a more worldwide way. It has to give itself the tools. I was talking about tools earlier, tools in terms of regulations, so then we're not in an unfavorable position when materials enter Europe. But also Europe needs to have tools for an offensive strategy, such as funds. Japan has a public fund to invest in raw materials. Korea has a public fund to invest in raw materials. So we could have a public fund in Europe, which would give us the means to secure our needs, whether it's raw materials for energy transition but also other types of raw materials, which have also proved to be very important for defense, for example. I think we don't have enough of these tools or instruments to be more extraterritorial approach outside Europe. The way that China looks at Europe means we have to have a better balance with this opposition between China and Europe, China and US and Europe. How do you see that? I'm very pleased that you talked to us about US and Europe. Our shareholder is Chinese, it's true, but the way we look at this subject of the competition between China, US and Europe is what we say is we need to go where the best skills are, the best technologies, the best brains. That's the important thing for us, and we want to have customers who are early adopters, who are going to adopt these technologies as early as possible. In that sense, the case of Europe is very interesting because historically we have developed our solar energy in California, wind in Northern Europe, for electric vehicles and flexibility for smart grids. Our world skill center is in Paris. France and Germany are really our pilot markets. And why is that? It's because Europe has drawn up an extraordinary law and tax, which is a coffee tax, which taxes automobile manufacturers for Scope 3 emissions that are sold to drivers. Thanks to this tax, the car manufacturers have mobilized to make Europe greener and to promote hybrid electric vehicles. to sell them to consumers, even German drivers who are a bit reluctant to buy electric vehicles. Volkswagen, to avoid paying 1 billion euros of penalties, has taken an incredible electric turn and is now one of the companies promoting electric vehicles. This is going to create problems for Elon Musk, because most of the sales of his carbon credits were based on what was happening in Germany. So thanks to this measure, Europe is becoming very attractive as a market. Electric vehicles, as we've seen, sales have been doubled in Germany since the beginning of the year. And that attracts investment from private companies such as ourselves. So I don't think we should think in terms of protectionism and of hybridization of resources. We also have to think about attractiveness of the markets through the right mechanisms to encourage the energy transition with consumers and to create champions who are able to develop the right technologies and grasp market opportunities. Perhaps we could have a French sovereign fund to invest massively in raw materials. That would be a good idea. We have plenty of commercials, people who would be perfectly capable of working on that basis. What I'm struck by is that when I talk about the disruption of raw material supply, which means our factories in China and Japan might not be able to work, I think France is doing okay. We're having problems as well in China and Japan. Eric Labaye will come to an end now, and perhaps we'll have one or two questions as well. There are people who have microphones in the room. Please raise your hands if you wanted to ask a question. I'll hand over to you just after Eric. Perhaps a little conclusion before we move on to the questions? Yes, a few words of conclusion, yes, based on the debate. First of all, I think that we've talked a lot about coherence. Economic, social and environmental coherence and geopolitical coherence. And there's a pluridisciplinary aspect, a holistic approach here concerning energy. We have to look at all of these different components. This is a fundamental task. One of the things I've learned. Another element is that in terms of innovation, we are making progress. We can see that renewable energies are becoming competitive. There are more and more innovations. It's a question of how quickly we continue with these innovations. The news is good so far, and we have to accelerate and intensify our efforts in innovation. The third point, we have seen that all of the players have to work together and work at the same time. How do we create this dynamic? We talked about market structure. That's important. We've talked about regulations. We now don't have to communicate more and involve citizens more. How can we have this virtuous circle so that everybody can make their own contribution in this overall environment? And the fourth point concerns Europe. In Europe, we can't do things by ourselves. In France, we need Europe. We are part of the solution is collective. And the last point is the acceleration. We need to increase the speed at which we do this. Thank you, Eric. We've had applause from the other areas. We now have to end. One question, perhaps, from the audience. Your conclusion was my question, in fact. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. No, only joking. We have to talk about the cost of the acceptability and the market of technologies. Ex ante, we can't do it, but ex post we can. Who is going to arbitrate? We have the market playing an important role. That's a fundamental question. We will see who is going to resolve that. My question, I have in front of me the McKinsey report to get to zero carbon by 2050. More than half of the technologies are already mature. 1/4 are in pilot projects, and the rest are emerging. Do you have an idea of the emerging technologies? It's not going to emerge in 2030. If it emerges in 2030, we'll have to prepare for it today. And what about the question of the tidal energy? I'm talking about magma or clouds. Of course, that's something else we'll look at in 20 years' time if we're still here. So very quickly, apart from everything you've listed, is it a bit utopian to talk about new technologies which have not been proven yet? Why, for example, why hasn't tidal power been developed more in France? In France and abroad, it's already been done. This is in other countries. We'll ask Marianne, perhaps, just to answer your question. As you said, tidal power is being worked on by factories in France. It's been duplicated in Korea. You're right. It's true that's It's a shame perhaps it hasn't been developed in France because of the problems with infrastructure and acceptability, but it's certainly a very interesting project, and it produces low carbon electricity that is amortized as well. Okay, I'm very sorry we don't have any more time. We have to hand back to the next round table. And thank you for listening. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you.